Everyone, Scott Sigrist. We have come a long way and we are coming down to the close of our course on modern political theory. Um, before I go any further, I feel that I should acknowledge the fan up here in the background. He's my biggest fan, and he's been with us through the whole semester or the whole filming part of the semester. So I should give due recognition um, because you've no doubt noticed him in the background, and he's been an important part of our enterprise. Um, so we've been discussing Eric Voegelin's Hitler and the Germans. In the last chapter, chapter 7, Voegelin gave his in-depth analysis of the nature of ideology as he understands it and what's driving it, right? And he concludes that ideology of the kind you get with National Socialism or Nazism is best understood as a kind of second reality, right? It's more than just a set of ideas or concepts about the world, but it is an imaginative uh, construction of a world, right, in which we want to live. And what's driving this is a deep dissatisfaction with the world as it is and a desire to sort of will a new one into place. And at the root of this uh, is a kind of phenomenon he calls pneumopathology, right? A disease of the spirit, um, in which the spirit is unfulfilled, it has become distorted, and it wants to falsify reality. There's an element of deliberate falsification uh, because this person really wants to believe that the pneumopath really wants to believe that he can make reality, transform reality into something acceptable to him, and this deliberate falsification is the distinguishing factor of pneumopathology. We'll develop that a little further in this last chapter. Um, and and this imposition of this constructed reality, the second reality, onto the first reality is is a kind of will to dominate. The libido dominandi, the lust for domination, is ultimately behind this. Okay, so this, of course, a lot more you could say, and we talked about it in the last lecture um, about ideologies and what's driving them. In chapter 8, the final chapter, the final lectures in Voegelin's series of lectures on Hitler and the Germans, Voegelin is coming down to the question of uh, what uh, what could have been done or what needed to be done uh, to provide the kind of uh, representation of a higher reality, of a higher justice, and so forth. Um, and what kind of people could have provided that. And that's the sort of background thinking behind his analysis of Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and Weber. Right? He says these are figures of world rank, as he calls them, great souls, um, the kind of people who had the capacity uh, for philosophy in the sense that Vogelin understands it with the ancients like Plato. They had the capacity for this, but they were not quite up to actually um, being great philosophers in that classic sense for various reasons. But what they did provide was a kind of resistance to the corruptions of the age. Um, they recognized certain problems with modernity and they put up a resistance to it, even though um, it was not entirely successful, right? Um, what they did provide, which is very helpful, Voegelin thinks, is an unmasking of the passions of the age, the passions driving modern man, right? That come to a head in the 20th century and explode into the violent, grotesque phenomena of National Socialism and communism, as we saw it in the Soviet Union. Um, so, what were the passions of the age? They they were, what Marx recognized as class struggle, right? What Nietzsche saw as a will to power, um, will to dominate. There was what Freud recognized as the the dominance of the libido, or the uh, instinct, right? He especially had the sexual instinct in mind as fundamental. In his late thought, um, Freud brought up an instinct called the death instinct that he describes in his book on society called Civilization and Its Discontents. Um, but instinct essentially is driving things. Freud thought. And then there's Max Weber with his unmasking of the utilitarian rational expediency of action, as Voegelin puts it. This sort of instrumental reasoning, calculating, what is useful to us, um, which results ultimately in the hyper rationalistic construction of the modern bureaucracy. Which, Weber is, the thing he's most famous for is his analysis of modern bureaucracy and the dynamics of bureaucracy, and especially the sort of um, constrictive, um, freedom crushing element of modern democracy, which Tocqueville notices in Democracy in America. Um, so so these were great souls. They were figures of world rank, right? And they recognized these pathologies of the modern period, and they all had common intellectual attitudes. Vogelin says towards reality, with respect to man and man's action in the world. They recognize these driving passions, right? Uh, Obsession with material well-being, power, conflict, and instinct. Um, they also recognize that values, modern values, were kind of masks for those passions. Um, People tried to pretty them up in various ways, but they recognized this this unseemlier, um, uglier business going on with these passions. And in terms of society, they shared what Vogelin calls an aristocraticism, right? A sort of a perspective from above, um, that that held ordinary citizens in contempt for, uh, to use Vogelin's phrase, um, their narrow-minded bourgeois morality of property and sexuality. They recognize. So, and just to clarify here, Vogelin does not approve of their contempt um, for the ordinary citizens, but he thinks there is something in their contempt for this bourgeois ideal, um, of sort of an external kind of moral decency, and the sort of focus on creature comforts, having a nice house and a car and a picket fence. The stereotypical way of life of the the modern bourgeois person, um, which is lacking some kind of um, drive for meaning or significance greater than these very mundane, low level pursuits, right? Um, but Voegelin again, I mean, considers these characters unsuccessful in their efforts to break out of the corruptions of the age. They don't succeed in breaking out of them. They recognize them, and sometimes with great clarity, but they themselves continue to be um, controlled by them in some ways. Um, and the reason Vogelin says that they fail to break out is twofold. One is their own spiritual closure to transcendence, to divine transcendence, right? This is especially true in the case of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. Um, as we suggest about Max Weber, Weber comes closer to breaking out, right? He's not entirely closed spiritually, um, but you know he still falls a little short. I'll save that discussion for his in-depth discussion of Weber coming up. The other problem was they lacked an integrated language for adequately recognizing, diagnosing, and confronting the problems. Because the old symbols and systematic analyses of the ancients about the problems of the spirit had become opaque to them. The word he uses in various contexts, opaque meaning they couldn't see into it. It was foggy. It was unclear to them, right? They didn't understand symbols like reason as originally used by Plato or faith as used by Christianity. Um, they could no longer make sense of them, partly because they had definitely, um, essentially, because they had lost experiential contact with those things, right? Um, so this brings us back to the problem of representation that Voegelin has brought up earlier. Essentially, the problem in Germany and the problem throughout Europe, because Germany, remember he suggests, was just an extreme version of a more general problem in Western civilization, right? And that's one of the reasons he's concerned about the Germans he's speaking to in his own time, that the underlying spiritual problems continue to plague them, even though um, they've been trying to move beyond Hitler, right? Um, but in this context of Germany, there were no figures of world rank, such as these men I just mentioned, who were capable of representing transcendence, right? Because they'd all become stupid in the sense that Voegelin talked about earlier, blind to that higher dimension of our lives, and illiterate in the sense that they couldn't read this, couldn't understand these symbols of this higher dimension that the ancient Greeks and the Christians brought out. So you see this kind of stupidity he's talking about and illiteracy applies even to the greatest minds of the 19th and 20th centuries. Um, it's a problem that is is not related to intelligence, but it's related to a deficiency in reason and spirit, as Voegelin has talked about. Right, it lost touch with reason in the sense of nous, um, that that orientation of the mind towards the ground of being, the transcendent divine ground of being, right? And they'd lost the noetic language of reason, developed in great um, detail and very systematically by Plato and Aristotle. A whole collection of rational concepts to help get to those dynamics of the spirit that ultimately are the foundation of human existence. So, why were these guys not capable of representing transcendence? Um, it's because they lost contact with reason and faith in the classic sense. Why had they lost contact with reason and faith? Why had they become stupid and illiterate um, in this sense? And Voegelin suggests some things that I want to tease out. You could boil down the problems essentially to a defective kind of modern science and to the rise of ideology, um, or these second realities that Voegelin has spoken of. So, in terms of modern science, we should start with the basic function of science. Get clear on that. I mean, what is the basic function of science? It is to accurately represent reality, right? Um, and modern science has come to be taken by intellectuals as the highest authority, the final word on reality um, in the modern context. That's coming into question now, but by postmodern philosophers who are beginning to doubt even science as authoritative in representing the truth about reality. Um, but but modern science is one of the many things that had sort of taken the place of reason and faith. It had become kind of its own religion, so that sometimes when this happens, the term used is scientism. Science itself becomes a kind of ideology. Um, but what was the failure of modern social science? Um, a couple of things are most critical, or four things I'll single out. First, it was reductionistic, right? The reality to be represented by modern science was reduced to, as Voegelin puts it, the experience of the world of things in space-time existence, right? Things that you could see and touch and measure, right? And put into kind of physical experiments, right? Or mathematize and so forth. Um, that's what reality had been reduced to by modern science. And Voegelin says episteme, in the classical sense, which was a knowledge of eternal being, was dead, right? So um, when when Aristotle used the term science, for example, the Greek term was episteme. It comes from the root word there is pistis, or faith, or belief, and the idea of episteme was, or the idea of science in the mind of Plato and Aristotle, was knowing the eternal. In a sense, it was the opposite of modern science. Modern science is concerned with knowing the ephemeral, with knowing the world of change, the world that's always coming into and out of existence, biological things, for example, come to life and they die and so forth. And there's all kinds of variation in the world of um, in, in the physical, in the world of space time, right? So it's a knowledge of the changeable material world, um, even though there are, you could maybe speak of some laws of nature that are consistent. Um, for the ancients, science was precisely a knowledge of the things that never change, right? Of the eternal. And that led them to the ground of being, this eternal source of existence, right? Um, the existing world was unstable in its being, so to speak, right? But the ground of being was eternal and, in that sense, reliable, right? And this related also to ethics, right? Modern social science had lost its ethical orientation, and the classic notion of science right? Ethical principles were eternal. The applications varied with circumstances, right? The applications of the principles, but the principles themselves were fixed and eternal. So, most fundamentally, for example, what is good for human beings is a fixed kind of thing, right? It has to do with human capacities, potentialities, to use Aristotle's language, um, and the perfection of those, right? The standard of the way you're supposed to live is what your highest potentialities are. And your highest potentialities of all were the potentiality of nous and the orientation towards the divine ground of existence, right? The foundation, the source of existence, including our existence now, um, because the substance, the sort of eternal substance that can take place within a human being comes from contact with uh, this eternal divine ground, right? Um, but modern science had not only rejected the possibility of moral knowledge, of moral truths, um, and relegated that morals to the realm of opinion, or even worse, to Hobbes's realm of pleasure and pain, where it simply was a matter of good is what I like and evil is what I don't like. If you recall that from Hobbes, not only had modern science uh, sort of rejected objective um, moral truth, but they had completely set aside ethics as irrelevant to science. The prevailing social science, positivism, we've talked about, right, deliberately set aside value judgments as unscientific, and um, and this made it impossible to examine phenomena like the Nazi mass murder regime, um, to examine that scientifically. I mean, if value judgments are left out, then the most important thing about that phenomenon, which is the moral outrage of mass murder, um, is incomprehensible. You can't recognize it scientifically. It boils down to just opinions about, well, I don't happen to like that thing. It violates my taste, right? But my taste isn't inherently, objectively, any better than anyone else's. So, Hitler has his kind of thing that makes him happy, and I have mine. But I can't really say I don't like Hitler's. I could say that I don't like it if he kills me or whatever. But right. And then another aspect about modern uh, science was, and it relates to what we just mentioned before, these previous elements, is a loss of meaning. The original function of science, in the sense of episteme, and this effort to understand eternal being, um, was ultimately establishment of meaning. What is the meaning of existence, right? And that is abandoned by modern political science. Questions of meaning, as opposed to just material fact, um, are set aside as not scientific, right? And then this ultimately results in a loss of representation of a meaningful, transcendent reality, a meaningful order of being for human life, right? The ultimate function of episteme in the classic sense was to represent a higher um, realm of being, a source of the meaning of our lives, right? And meaningful ordering of our lives uh, that ultimately takes the form of social and political order, right? So, with modern science, you had a representation of the space time world, but not of right order and man and his dignity. Right? You didn't have that represented by modern science. Um, and so that all prepared the way for these individuals of a high rank, of world rank, as Voegelin puts it. They had no spiritual resources to draw on. The way that they thought about the world in terms of being scientific, it offered nothing to them on that level, right? And then you had ideology, the ideological distortions that come along with ideology. Um, as I suggested, science itself can become an ideology, a kind of religion. Um, but in the absence of science taking the function of representing meaningful order in history, um, people turned to ideology. Ideology played that role. Ideology served the representative function of meaningful existence now, right? Um, the, Something had to fill that role because the need for a meaningful sense of reality, right, um, has not changed. In fact, the structure of reality itself has not changed. Uh, Human beings continue to exist in that in between that Plato symbolized in terms of the myth of the puppet player, right? With the golden cord pulling us up to higher things, nobler things, and the steely cords of passion pulling us down to lower things, right? And we live in that in between those pulls. Um, that reality has not changed. Um, the ideologies try to escape that tension of um, that struggle to respond to the higher calling of the golden cord and to resist the downward pull of the passions, right? Um, that's difficult. That's a difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of struggle, right? And people want to escape that. And that's what the ideologies provide. So, quoting Voegelin, um, since the non existent reality, I don't like that phrase, one of the few phrases that Voegelin uses that I don't like because it's very confusing to people. What he means by the non existent reality is the reality beyond this world, this ground of being that we talked about, this source foundation of existence, right? Since that reality cannot be abolished, the empty space arising from its discrediting must be refilled with the symbolism of the second reality. In other words, a new world of meaning. Uh, the second realities of ideologies are meant to fill the empty space where this this understanding of transcendence uh, used to be, right? Uh, the meaning it used to provide. It's now being provided by these second realities. That's what people are looking to for their sense of reality. And along with this second reality always comes a new representation of man, right? Man is now seen, um, is now represented in the context of a godless universe, right? And as Vogelin puts it, man is transformed from the imago Dei, the image of God, into an imago humanus, another an image of man. Man now understood as a mere clever animal driven by those passions mentioned above, right? Man struggling for life and material satisfactions, as opposed to man who is pulled towards higher reality, um, um, as well as towards these the pull of the passions, right? Um, and here you might think of Plato's disordered loves. Early in the semester, very beginning of the semester, I talked about Plato's analysis of um, the internal dynamics of human of human life, which is described in terms of the soul, right? And that the the defining difference between a better constitution of city and soul uh, was the order of loves, what it loved the most, and so the best regime loved the highest good, right? This divine ground of being symbolized in the cave allegory by the sun, right? Which Plato describes as a divine being beyond being, which gives um, meaning to everything by enabling us to understand the basis of what's good in the world, right? This love for this highest thing and the related love of virtue, right formation of the soul, gets reduced to lower things like honor, wealth, pleasure, power, right? Um, so um, so Voegelin understands these modern ideological mass movements as what in earlier writings he called political religions, right? There was a vacuum of meaning after the breakdown of Christianity, and that vacuum of meaning must now be filled by something else, right? And action in history now takes the form of, to use Vogelin's words, progressive and revolutionary activism. That is what fills the void. That is the nature of the modern ideologies. Just uh, to to stress the point that Vogelin is not simply giving a religious interpretation coming out of Christianity. Um, Nietzsche described the situation in Europe the same way. Nietzsche looked at the European scene and he said, um, after the breakdown of Christianity, there is this vacuum of meaning, and people need to find some meaning as a replacement, or really bad things are going to happen. He predicted really bad things would happen in Europe if uh, if some kind of adequate replacement was not found. Um, and he even predicted a rise of the blonde beast in Germany, right? Um, Nietzsche's answer was, "We'll create our own meaning." Logan will look at this here in this analysis, show what's problematic about it. Um, but so these ideologies rushed in to fill the void of meaning left by the breakdown of Christianity. That's historically the the development, right? And behind these ideologies were always some pneumopathological intellectuals, right? Intellectuals who are diseased in spirit, who imagined these second realities, who constructed, made up these ideologies, right? And behind them were always some pneumopathological great souls, right? Uh, People who are capable of philosophy in the classic sense, and therefore of virtue in the most supreme degree, but had become corrupted by various influences, and now, um, uh, you know, developed philosophical systems that were used and turned into ideological systems. So, for example, um, what you have in Marx is taken by a guy like Lenin and made into a just plano ideology as opposed to a derailed philosophical reflection. Um, so, um, so, what was the response of these great souls um, of what was the order he put them in? Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and Weber. Um, what was their reaction to the alienation they experienced from transcendence? Right. And Voegelin says, well, their basic response was disillusionment and accompanied by the feeling of obligation to live one's life without the illusions of transcendence. Right? They recognized a loss of transcendence. Right? It's a godless universe, um, as it had come to be seen, and this brought a sense of disillusionment because it had always been thought that for a meaningful existence there has to be an ultimate meaning of reality, an ultimate meaning of the universe. And the godless universe meant that there is no such meaning, right? Um, I mentioned Nietzsche. Voegelin mentions Nietzsche as a kind of paradigmatic example. He's disillusioned with the state of things, and he searches for some kind of replacement meaning. Um, the problem is strikingly illustrated by the philosopher Camus, the French philosopher Albert Camus. Um, he wrote an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, which captured the problem. Sisyphus was an ancient Greek myth that where this figure who had rebelled against the gods, this guy named Sisyphus, was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, um, which would then roll back down, and then he would have to roll it back up, and then it would roll back down, and this would happen eternally, right? This was his curse. This sort of meaningless action again and again without any kind of ultimate conclusion. And Camus presented this um, the godless universe as suggesting this kind of life for man. But unlike Nietzsche, where it's kind of an irresponsible uh, quest for meaning, everybody else be damned. I'm going to create my own meaning. I'm going to impose it on others. My philosophical vision or whatever. Camus said he tried to maintain a sense of responsibility to others, and this was kind of this burden of rolling this boulder up a hill again and again, um, in the sense of shouldering the responsibility of taking care of others, doing good to others, even though there wasn't any ultimate meaning to it. And Camus actually presents the philosophical problem extremely starkly with an idea that he says, in the context of this meaningless universe, the first question for the philosopher must be, why should I not commit suicide? Why do people commit suicide? Because they've lost a sense that life has meaning for them anymore, right? Um, and that's why they're ready to set it aside, right? And Camus asked the question: if the universe is in fact meaningless, why should we not commit suicide? And the answer he gives is this kind of taking on this burden of doing of taking responsibility for others, right? Of trying to help others. And, that's his reason for not committing suicide. Um, well, that certainly puts things in perspective. Um, so, what did these guys do uh, now that they've sort of accepted living in a meaningless universe? And Voegelin says basically they kind of play a spiritual game. This need for uh, deeper meaning has not gone, and so they're reduced to playing this what Nietzsche had called a game of masks. So the game that Nietzsche plays is uh, is Voegelin says it takes the place of Plato's serious play. Serious play was Plato once called, or Socrates once called the enterprise of philosophy as serious play. What it meant was, um, we sort of play around with serious ideas, trying to understand the meaning of life. It has a serious purpose, but we don't take ourselves too seriously in this. We recognize that there is a greater meaning, um, but we can't adequately know it, and so we kind of play with how to understand this, right? Um, Nietzsche says, well, there is no ultimate meaning, so you can't have that kind of play. Um, what he does instead is a game of masks. Now, Voegelin doesn't explain this as clearly here in the um, Hitler and the Germans lectures as he does in another place. In another place, in a book called Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, which I won't explain the title for now, Nietzsche himself says about this game of masks, he speaks of it as a resolve for ignorance, because what a self-aware philosopher realizes when he takes when he realizes the logical implications uh, of his position, finds it hard to live with it. So, in Nietzsche's case, he said the will to power drives everything. The will to assert yourself on the world, right? That's this sort of it's a sort of more sophisticated understanding of Darwinian, right, survival of the fittest. It's because it's all encompassing, all inclusive, emotionally, physically, everything. I'm trying to assert my life, um, and that's what drives me. This will to power, but it has no higher meaning or anything. Um, and but then a philosopher who has any intellectual honesty has to say, well, then that means what I'm doing is simply a will to power, and therefore it has no sort of objective meaning. Um, and when he begins to realize this, uh, the what Nietzsche calls the cruelty of the intellectual conscience starts to bother him. It starts bothering him that he is um, that he is playing this game with reality, uh, that he is ignoring the consequences, or has been ignoring the consequences of his uh, assertions philosophically, um, and acting like life has meaning, even though he's been saying that it doesn't, right? And so what he does is he takes off the mask of one approach that he was doing and puts on another philosophical masks, right? And he keeps doing that whenever it starts to bother him, uh, the implications of what he's saying for himself and for his own thinking. And so he keeps switching masks. And Nietzsche himself says, this is a resolve for ignorance. I resolve that I'm not going to look at the fact that what I'm doing is essentially meaningless. Um, and this is the element of pneumopathology that Voegelin spoke of, right? This is the primary symptom of this diseased soul, that you start lying to yourself, right? You resolve ignorance. You resolve not to look at certain things that bother you, because then you'd have to really deal with them. Well, when the suffering of meaningless, as Voegelin puts it, becomes intense enough, um, these guys um, resort to creating second realities. To quote Voegelin, the the meaninglessness of a God-forsaken existence, and thus of a dehumanized man, the way humanity was understood before, leads to outbreaks of concupiscent fantasy. Remember again, concupiscent is an old-fashioned word for lust, right? Um, a lustful fantasy, a fantasy from libido dominandi, right, to the grotesque creation of a new man. So, this is it's hard to live with what this the reality I've taken to be the case that the world is meaningless, and so I'm going to um, create a new man that would make things better. Um, so Marx creates the socialist man. Marx talks about this, creating a new man, right? And Nietzsche talks about becoming the overman, the Übermensch, or the Superman, as it's sometimes called, the man who dominates reality, the man who establishes control. And Nietzsche is very clear about this, that this is a kind of will to be God and involves a revolt against God. So I'll take Marx first. So Marx wants to present man as self-created. He talks about this, Marx talks about this in his Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, where he rejects the question about any kind of ultimate divine ground of existence. He says, because he rejects that as a stupid question. And he says, man is the ground of his own existence. But he can create his own identity through his work. Remember, Marx understands meaningfulness in human life in terms of creating things, right? Um, and so he can remake his own existence through his work, right? And when he talks about God, Marx said, remember, Marx had said the fundamental critique, the basis of all other critiques of the critiques of the kind that he's making is a critique of religion and a rejection of religion. And in this rejection of religion, he says that God is just a projection of ourselves, right? We're not made in God's image, but God is made in our image, right? And we can take God back into ourselves, recognize that those are just idealized qualities that we have within ourselves. So we can be self-creators, and we can create a new self in a new world. And then Nietzsche puts it even more starkly in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's his one great literary work where he tells a kind of story of this guy named Zarathustra, who is a kind of atheist prophet. And he goes around telling everybody that, there's this huge significant event that's happened in the world, and that is the realization that God is dead, that there is no God. And he goes around warning everybody that this is going to result in a crisis if they don't, find some other way to feed the spirit, so to speak. But there's one really revealing statement he makes in one part of the book, Zarathustra. He says, I'm quoting, "Let me reveal my heart to you entirely, my friends. If there were gods, how could I endure not to be a god? Hence, there are no gods." I'll let you think about the logical fallacy in that, which Nietzsche is quite well aware of. Let me just read that again. If there were gods, how could I endure not to be a god? Hence, there are no gods. Right? Why do I not believe in God? Because I want to be a god. In other words, right? And that's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And then in another book called The Gay Science, which means like a happy science, that's where Nietzsche makes his famous statement that God is dead, That's where the quote comes from. But most people don't know the fuller quote. The fuller quote is, "God is dead. We have killed him, you and I." Right? Um, as by rejecting the God that we've inherited through Christianity, we in the West, um, we've killed him. Right? I mean, he's kind of playing on the theme that in Christianity, the God Man Jesus dies, right, and then is resurrected. But he is saying that we have realized that Christianity is not true. That there is no God, um, and so we've sort of killed him by rejecting him, right? And he presents this kind of as a tragic situation that could become an opportunity. Right? It's tragic because we've lost the world of meaning that we get by recognizing that uh, you know or by believing that the universe has a purpose, and it's fused with divine significance, and that we are divine creatures with uh, you know uh, extraordinary dignified status. Um, and okay, so we're gonna have to set that all aside. So that's tragic, and it could result in bad things if we don't come up with something better. But it's an opportunity for us to come up with something where we can be gods, right? Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, um, spoke of this kind of thing, at least, as a replacement of the real God man with a man God. Um, so all of that is to say, why these figures of world rank, these truly great souls, um, people who are capable of philosophy and representing a transcendent order, um, were not able to do so because they had lost contact with that transcendent order. Right. So, what's the way out of this abyss we find ourselves in? This is the crisis of modernity for Voegelin. The crisis of modernity is that we've lost this sense of ultimate meaning in losing the uh, belief and the contact with this divine ground of being, right? Um, and for the purposes of showing the way out, he looks to Max Weber. Max Weber, one of these great souls, these figures of world rank, right, responded differently from the others, right? Even though he shared some things with them, as we pointed out earlier, he unmasks the passions of the age. He has certain similar attitudes um, that he shares with them, but he responded differently to the crisis of modernity, and that different response points the way out. And Weber is a good example of how to find our way out because he struggles himself to find the way out, and he comes close to getting out. So we can follow the sort of footsteps of Weber uh, to where we need to get. So what was Weber's response to the crisis of modernity? Well, first of all, Voegelin points out Weber's humility and his stamina in resisting the ideological and revolutionary temptation. These other guys gave in to the second reality. They created second realities, right? Um, they engaged in this sort of attempt to revolt against reality and transform reality. The revolutionary temptation that Voegelin suggests here. Um, and Weber opts instead uh, for a cold, unflinching analysis of immanence, right, of life in a world without God, as it appears in the modern era. He just describes it and analyzes it. He doesn't try to escape it. He just describes it. Right? And this takes real mental toughness and kind of rejection of the kind of arrogance of these people who want to force their systems on reality, right? Um, Second element of his response was an effort to establish personal responsibility. To quote Voegelin, he wanted to educate the revolutionaries to a sense of responsibility by making them aware of the consequences of their action. Um, one of the potential revolutionaries that would be a case in point. I don't know if he was influenced at all by Weber, but this guy Camus was one of these guys who instead of responding like these other guys, even though he accepted their premise that you know that existence is essentially meaningless, um, he took responsibility for the consequences of actions, and Camus recognized along with Weber that these radical programs that everybody was resorting to had terrible consequences for human beings. Um, you can look at the millions murdered by uh, the Nazi regime and by the Soviet regime, for example. Um, and then there was uh, Weber's very significant, Vogelin thinks, very significant personal breakdown. He kind of has a mental breakdown uh, because of this impossible task, for a decent person at least, of remaining in the value free social science. Weber was totally committed to this idea, this positivistic notion of social science, as values free. I'm going to set aside values. I'm simply going to describe, right, and show how things work and everything. But I'm not going to make some kind of ultimate value judgment about it. But because he's dealing with values in the analysis, um, it just puts incredible strain on him uh, to, to keep doing that. In other words, because there are real values at stake, and because in fact Weber is a decent person who believes in taking responsibility and so forth, and therefore has values, right? It just becomes too much, and he breaks down, um, and he starts approaching his scientific analysis a little differently. And Voegelin describes Weber's movement towards recovery in terms of, he says, he engaged, quote, the entire materials for the history of mankind in order to elaborate something like a philosophy of humanity. I believe the critical work here for Weber was a book called Economy and Society. It really is just across civilizations this systematic study of human experience. Um, and, uh, and and one more thing Voegelin suggests about Weber's response to this crisis of modernity, and then to his own personal crisis, right? Voegelin points to what he calls Weber's extreme spiritual sensitivity, right, which led him into a quest for recovery. And even though Weber did not make a definitive breakthrough, the way Voegelin says, he tried to keep a hole open, so to speak, to transcendence, a hole out of the cave. So if you think of the cave image in Plato, um, he kept an openness to transcendence, even though he didn't quite break out of the cave. So Voegelin summarizes Weber's achievement. First, Weber clearly outlined the problematic. Remember how Voegelin started off the whole series of lectures by saying, what is the problematic here? What is the problem that we need to solve in looking at, Nazi Germany? And he said, it's Hitler and the Germans. It's this person Hitler and how people responded to him, right? And it was Hitler's second reality. His second reality was this Nazi, ideology. It was sort of his creation, and and people bought into bought into Hitler himself, and they bought into this ideology. Um, that was the problematic in that, in what Voegelin's studying here. Weber outlined the problematic of the modern world in the sense of the meaninglessness of a purely immanent existence, a purely this worldly, space-time world existence. And Weber's word for this was disenchantment. He said, with the sort of breakdown of Christianity, the world has become disenchanted. It's no longer charged with meaning, right? And everybody sort of, you know, um, it's the kind of feeling of a post-apocalyptic world. Um, so he recognizes the problematic, this meaninglessness of a purely immanent existence. Second, he reconceives politics as, a quote Voegelin here, as a field determined by passion, responsibility, and a sense of proportion. Right. Um, and these are terms he defines in a way that points towards a Platonic Aristotelian philosophy. Right. We're driven by passions, but we have a responsibility to sort of keep things in order and establish a sense of proportion in the way we act. Right. Um, then there was a kind of recognition of transcendence by Weber in his knowledge of the tragic, as Voegelin puts it. Right? If the world is a tragedy, that means it has meaning, right? Or if there's a tragic dimension of life, it means there are real things at stake, right? And that there are meaningful catastrophes as opposed to a series of meaningless events, right? Um, then Weber reestablished a sense of human dignity and of ethics with his categories of, and these are Weber's terms, an ethics of responsibility and an ethics of intention. The ethics of responsibility was the responsibility to oppose evil, and the ethics of intention was the kind of love exemplified in the saint, right? Two kinds of ethics, and so here's Weber. He doesn't actually go to the point of totally endorsing these ethics, but he describes them in such a way that it's obvious that he thinks that's the best, right? Um, and so through this process, Weber comes to a near recovery of natural law in its classic sense, like Thomas Aquinas, with his ideal types of right order. What Plato had been doing with saying, okay, here's the good man and here's the bad kinds of human beings based on their order of soul and their order of loves and so forth, right? And Weber starts working out these ideal types of right order. So he is recognizing you know the meaning of existence. He's recognizing right and wrong and so forth, and he's spelling it out, right, without actually committing. Um, and finally, uh, Weber establishes the beginnings of what Voegelin calls a philosophy of history, a vision of history that's not simply a vision of progress or of materialism, um, but a a story of human drama, of struggle for meaning, and the kind of spiritual struggle that the ancient Christians talked about. And underlying all this, Voegelin says, is a sort of emerging mysticism in Weber. Sort of feels this spiritual pull of the golden cord, if you will. And this is how Voegelin ends, right? He's symbolically, there's a picture of, okay, so it's a real story, but Weber is in his house at night talking to his wife. He's sitting over in a dark corner. We can't see him. He's smoking a cigar, and the light of the cigar, is kind of moving around. And this is Voegelin uses this sort of symbolically, but he says to his wife, I think I might be a mystic. And his wife is surprised because, you sort of dedicated your whole life to not being a mystic, and trying to be scientific in this modern scientific notion of scientific. And Vogelin sees this as revealing. He's he is he is engaged in the quest for the transcendent, even though he hasn't fully given away to it. Um, so, so we see with Weber, Vogelin's suggestions about the way out. We recognize that the basic modern problem is this spiritual emptiness and corresponding meaninglessness, right? This disconnect from reason and spirit, the way Vogelin's talked about it. We reconceive science and politics and human existence away from these uh, rather empty, superficial modern categories, and and start recovering the sense of the tragic, of ethics, of responsibility, of the different types of human beings. The type, for example, as Vogelin fleshed out, of the kind of person Hitler was, and the kind of people who responded to them, and why they responded in different ways according to the kind of person they were. Right? You remember Hesiod's three human types, and Plato had developed those human types much more in depth, and much more um, in a much more sophisticated way. And Weber's trying to do that as well. These are the kind of things we need to do to reestablish or to overcome stupidity and illiteracy, in the sense Vogelin has talked about, and to establish a real recovery of reason and spirit, right? And then the ability to know the kind of sources, whether it's certain modern novels or things like the writings of the ancients, right? Um, to read those, to study them, to get down to the the spiritual core, if you will, right? This is the way out, according to Vogelin. This is how we overcome the crisis of modernity. It's a long struggle. It's not something that involves a system. It's not something that can magically happen overnight. So you can't accomplish it by iron will, as a lot of these ideologues suggest. It's a long struggle, probably multi-generational, but it's a struggle that each of us can make, can be involved in. Vogelin was fond of telling his students, um, there is no obligation to uh, submit to the corruptions of the age. In fact, there is a duty to resist. And Vogelin has tried to lay out the means of resistance. And that involves becoming the kind of person, uh, the kind of person of substance who can put up a real substantive uh, response. Okay, um, that's it on Vogelin. I'm going to give you one more lecture, short lecture, just kind of giving you some conclusions for takeaways from the course. All right, I'll see you then.